Over the next few weeks, we will be discussing the book of Philippians, which is a short letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a small church which gathered in the Roman colony of Philippi. Historically, Philippi is known for being the site of a famous Civil War battle that happened between the senators who had murdered Julius Caesar and those who would defend his honor and become the new emperors of the Roman world. However, all of this was distant history during the time of the New Testament, where instead Philippi was known as the regional center of banking and government, meaning you were far more likely to find people wearing business togas than soldiers' uniforms. The book of Acts tells us that Paul first visited Philippi during his second missionary journey. Since there was not a Jewish synagogue in Philippi at the time, Paul went down to the river one Sabbath and found several Jewish women there doing a Bible study. Most prominently among them was a woman named Lydia, who would later become a saint of the church. Paul stayed in her house with her family until he left Philippi 3 months later. Towards the end of that time, Paul drove out a future-telling demon from a slave girl in the marketplace, and this offended the wrong people, and Paul was put into prison. But that night there was an earthquake, which shook loose the prison doors, and the jailer, horrified that the prisoners had escaped, went to take his own life, but Paul saved him by yelling, "Don't worry, we're all here." Then Paul preached the gospel of hope to the jailer, and the entire jailer's house was baptized. The next day, Paul left Philippi, but he wrote this letter a year or two later, where he was again in prison. And though this letter is shortest in the entire Bible, it is packed with the most meaning. All your favorite church words appear in this letter. It is most known for being a letter of joy and of gratitude. As Paul says that even though his circumstances are dire, he rejoices and gives thanks to God because he knows God is working. And of course, he wants the Philippians and us to join him in that. Although grace does not feature prominently in this letter, the word and the idea of faith is central, particularly the idea of the faith belonging to Jesus Christ. It is because of the faith that is of Jesus Christ that Paul is able to rejoice and give thanks, and it is his strong conviction that God is working for good that allows him to keep his head up, and this is a faith he encourages them and us to share. But more than that, the idea of work and service appears prominently in this letter. The words work, service, and their many synonyms are the most common in the letter, even more than joy and gladness and gratitude. For Paul, it isn't enough to express gratitude or to feel joy or to believe that something might happen. All those things must encourage us to do the works of God. And it is in Philippians that Paul says that we must work out our salvation for fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in us. And for this reason, another prominent feature is the idea of a business partnership, or in what in the New Testament is called a koinonia, or a coin share. Koinonias are those who share everything in common, and in Philippians it most refers to a business relationship. Since Philippians was a place of commerce and business, the church in Philippi would have known something about fellow investors and fellow co-workers and fellow coin shares. Philippians is a very missional letter because it's about sharing in the mission of Christ. Not just being family, not just being friends, not just being people who share a pew, but for Paul, Christians are those who share in the work and the business of Christ. And what is the mission of the Lord? But to do works of righteousness, which is works of love and works of humility. All these things feature prominently in the letter as Paul encourages the Philippians to do works of righteousness, which for him were works of love. And he encourages them to be humble, for it is through humility that we can best express the love and the attitude of Christ. All of this grows in the knowledge of the Lord. He pleads for their love to not just be ooey gooey and abstract, but for them to become more wise and have more knowledge. It's in Philippians that we have the famous verse 4:8 where Paul says, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is loving, think about those things, and then the peace of Christ will be with you. And all of these things enable us all to have the attitude of Christ. Which leads us to the second chapter of Philippians, which is the centerpiece of this letter, but it's also the centerpiece of Paul's theology and of early church theology, because in Philippians 2, the Apostle Paul sings a song about Jesus. It's one of the earliest Christian songs we have. It's called the Great Christ Hymn, where Paul sings about the attitude of Christ, who being in the very form of God did not consider equality with God something to exploit, but Christ emptied himself. In Church, we call this a U-shaped Christology because it refers to a God who started out in the heavens and then became less than the least of human beings and was lowered into the very depths of the earth. But then because of that, he was exalted back to the right hand of God, where every tongue will confess and every knee will bow down. It is this U-shaped Christology that Paul wants us to have. It is this U-shaped Christology that should define the life of every Christian, that we should be humbling ourselves and lowering ourselves and becoming last, because it is the last who will be first. And so Paul exemplifies this in himself. In the very next section, he praises Timothy and Epaphroditus for having a U-shaped life, for giving everything to the service of the Lord. And he wants the Philippians and, of course, us to have this attitude in ourselves. I look forward to reading this amazing letter with you.